Sometimes your best laid plans get thwarted by circumstances beyond your control. The best example, of course, is the year 2020, a continuous reminder of just how overriding factors can play havoc with what you were hoping to accomplish. But for this particular story, we're going to go back about a quarter of a century to a night in which the World Wrestling Federation tried to run a promising B-level pay-per-view only for everything to go horribly wrong. One minute, the program was getting ready to transition into the evening's second match, and the next minute, the entire broadcast plunged into darkness with no available antidote to the sudden problem. I'm Jack from Cultaholic, and this is the true story of the storm that ruined a WWE pay-per-view. The month of May 1996 had already been a difficult one for Vince McMahon's World Wrestling Federation, if only for one wince-inducing moment. On Sunday, May 19th, inside the hallowed halls of New York's Madison Square Garden, Razor Ramon and Diesel broke character long enough to take part in their WWE farewell. At the conclusion of the main event, Scott Hall and Kevin Nash shared hugs with respective on-screen rivals in Hunter Hearst Helmsley and WWF champion Shawn Michaels. The Kliq raised arms together in what became known to wrestling fans as the curtain call, preceding Hall and Nash's impending move to WCW where, well, you know, everything changed. The chummy demonstration between faces and heels annoyed many behind the scenes in WWF, an organization that was not only struggling creatively and financially, but was also in a consumer's war with that very WCW that Hall and Nash were taking their talents to. While it wasn't quite the WWF's end times, they'd certainly seen better days. But a strong pay-per-view offering could really help remedy that. A whole 24 hours before Hall's intrusive debut on the May 27th edition of WCW Monday Nitro, the WWF produced their 8th ever In Your House event, emanating from the Civic Center in Florence, South Carolina. Subtitled Beware of Dog due to Davey Boy Smith's participation in the main event, the planned 5-match card had as promising a lineup as a middling new generation WWF could probably have provided at the time, in all fairness. Davey Boy would challenge Michaels for the WWF title, the crux of a recent storyline in which the British Bulldog and wife Diana accused Michaels of making unwelcome advances towards Diana. Soap opera aside, the two participants certainly had it in them to deliver a technically brilliant main event. The rest of the card was a bag of curiosities. Steve Austin was set to face off with his rival Savio Vega in what was being billed as a Caribbean strap match. The Undertaker actually had his sights set on the IC title, challenging Goldust in his trademark casket match. A couple of other recent angles reached their logical pay-per-view destination as Vader was pitted against fellow Gargantuan Yokozuna, while Wildman Mark Mero was matched up with Helmsley. Speaking of Helmsley, Pay-Per-View Sunday hadn't started off very well for him. Beware of Dog marked the first WWF event of any sort since the aforementioned curtain call incident at the Garden, and as noted, there were a lot of bad feelings behind the scenes. Wrestlers who'd already grown weary of the Kliq shenanigans were very displeased by this breach of kayfabe, as were veteran agents and staffers that had dedicated a hefty chunk of their adult lives to protecting the business. Helmsley and Michaels met with Vince McMahon earlier on that Sunday, and the WWF's 2 remaining Kliq members were given some disheartening news. Because many of the WWF senior officials and such were upset by the group's demonstration, Helmsley was going to have to be punished as a make good, despite Shawn's claim that McMahon had apparently endorsed the curtain call in the first place. Michaels was spared punishment because he was champion and the WWF needed him to remain strong. But the still mid-card Helmsley, he was hardly as immune. He spent the next several months on almost exclusive job duty and missed out on his planned victory in the '96 King of the Ring tournament. The start of Helmsley's strung-out burial process was to lose to Mark Mero, the first of many wrestlers that would pin his shoulders to the canvas over the ensuing 5 months. And that match was to lead off In Your House, Beware of Dog. Now, Florence, South Carolina might be a bit of a confusing location for a pay-per-view. Florence was definitely not what you'd consider an A-town. In fact, most of the In Your Houses to this point had beamed out from smaller, similar TV taping locales like Saginaw and Hershey, and Florence was of that ilk. The 11th most populous city in South Carolina wasn't all that steeped in WWF history, but it was the location for the near-fabled Hart Brothers vs. Steiner Brothers match from 1994, so it did have that going for it. Also unusual was the fact that the pay-per-view was taking place on Memorial Day weekend, something WWE had never attempted before, nor have they since. For all intents and purposes, Memorial Day is what Americans view as the start of the summer season, and many use that 3-day weekend to take some form of group vacation, many of them at rented beachfront properties, so it might not be the wisest move to schedule a pay-per-view for that weekend, something that AEW apparently doesn't seem to mind doing with Double or Nothing. WWF was hamstrung by WCW running their Slamboree event on May 19th, and seeing as WWF ran their previous pay-per-view on April 28th, then May 26th was the only real option for an event, whether it was a holiday weekend or not. Nonetheless, the WWF drew a respectable 6,000 fans to the Civic Center, and close to 4,800 of them were paid tickets. So, for a few thousand folks, a casket match was preferable to sitting in gridlocked beach traffic, apparently. The free-for-all portion of the card, which is what we call the kickoff show these days, provided us with a title change as the now heel Smoking Guns upended Henry and Phineas Godwin for the World Tag Team titles. Following that, we had an untelevised dark match in which Bob Sparkplug Holly defeated a soon-to-be repackaged Isaac Yankem, and then we were ready to begin with the pay-per-view telecast. As planned, Helmsley jobbed out Tamiro in a pretty good opening match, losing the 16-minute seesaw battle after being slingshotted into the ring post. And then it happened. Before they could present us with the Steve Austin-Savio Vega strap match, everything went black. Torrential storms in the area throughout the day had the Federation's production crew concerned about the possibility of a power outage. Michael Hayes later described the storm as wicked, calling it one of the worst storms he had ever seen, while Bruce Pritchard illustrated the rain coming down not in drops, but in sheets. It was as Vega made his entrance that the pay-per-view feed completely died when lightning struck one of the transformers. The Civic Center experienced a complete loss of power as a result of the storm. Fans watching at home were met with a stock on-screen message that varied depending on their provider, but each one of them indicated some sort of technical difficulties. Meanwhile, back in Florence, a sense of panic and confusion took hold of most of the crew on hand. An outage wasn't totally unexpected given the near-biblical storm outside, but now that one had occurred, what do they do now? In wrestling, of course, they say the show must go on, and here, it did. The venue still had minimal visibility thanks to emergency lights that were triggered by the outage. With cameramen patrolling ringside with battery-operated cameras, the decision was made to continue with the matches for the benefit of the attending crowd, even if the action was largely shrouded. Besides, the power might come back on in 2 minutes, or maybe 6 hours, who knows. You imagine that they wouldn't want to run the risk of stopping the show, causing restless fans to call it a night, only for power to be restored in 20 minutes or so with a mostly empty crowd. It does make sense. Vega and Austin went on as planned, and the two heavyweights lashed each other with the leather strap with nothing but bare minimum lighting and maybe a merciful camera flash illuminating the brawl. Don't forget, this was before the age of smartphones that can provide obscene amounts of light, so it wasn't even an option. Austin and Vega brutalized each other over the course of the 15-minute match, which Savio won. Yokozuna and Vader followed, ending with a Yoko victory after just 3 minutes. Next up was the Undertaker vs Goldust casket match for the IC title, going only 8 minutes when a slew of heels including Austin, Vader, Yankem and Bradshaw stormed the ring to help stuff Undertaker into the coffin. Original plans, however, had called for someone else to interfere. The planned intruder was meant to be Undertaker's nemesis, Mankind. After Taker and Goldust teased stuffing each other into the casket a time or 2 or 7, the finish would see Undertaker open the lid only for Mankind to be lying in wait. He would lunge forth, putting his mandible claw on Undertaker, immobilizing him and allowing Goldust to steal the win. To achieve this effect, Mankind had to covertly enter the casket through some sort of trapdoor late in the match. Preceding that, he would be under the ring watching the match on a monitor and wearing a headset from which he could receive instructions and his cue from those at gorilla position. So if you've been paying attention so far, you'll know that there was a power outage, thus leaving Mick Foley under the ring with no electronic forms of communication. He was left in the dark in more than one sense, a lonely soul under the ring in a rigid leather mask. Surely we can all relate to that. Through the outage, Pritchard basically had to play go-between with Vince at ringside and the crew in the back in terms of figuring out what to do as the minutes passed. In his travels, it occurred to him that Mrs. Foley's baby boy was under the ring with absolutely no clue in hell what was going on. After all, his devices may have died off, but he could still hear his peers getting slammed on the mat above him, so the chances are he's not assuming a total loss of power, surely. Knowing that he had to clue Foley in, Pritchard poked his head under the ring skirt to give Mick the heads up. Anybody who saw this probably saw nothing more than an unnamed staffer looking for something under the ring, but it is funnier to imagine him dressed as Brother Love at the time, admittedly. By the time Undertaker took that ride in the burial box, the power was still out. Viewers at home got a brief message from announcers McMahon and Jerry Lawler before the casket match, which was the first time in close to half an hour that the pay-per-view broadcast aired anything besides a blank screen or a graphic saying "please stand by." Vince urged viewers to stay tuned because they were going to try to bring them the 2 singles title matches, power permitting, but as indicated, the casket match came and went with no light. It must be noted that according to accounts from those present that evening, Vince was absurdly calm in spite of the circumstances. During Bruce Pritchard's sweat-inducing marches all over while trying to formulate a plan, his semi-panicked forays to Vince at ringside found the boss to be calmly sipping coffee, completely engaged in the strap match between Austin and Vega. Why would he not be? All the while, Pritchard's stammering out contingency plans and seeking higher approval, and Vince is apparently barely listening, instead marveling at the beating that Austin and Vega were giving each other. Lawler, meanwhile, remembers the night slightly differently and does recall Vince being a bit more helpful and trying to talk people through it. After the casket match, Bradshaw and Jake Roberts were sent out to stall for time, and it just so happened that right as the match began, power was restored and the lights came back on, so they went home after 30 seconds with Roberts winning. This left a fair amount of time for the WWF title match to go on unencumbered, but instead of being a wrestling classic, it ended up a muddled, disjointed mess. The participants were already in bad moods by the inability to get into a proper frame of mind before heading to the ring, and the match reflected their compromised focus. Michaels in particular was visibly irritated by a shrieking heckler and took time during a rest hold to yell at her to shut up. All of this negative energy rang out louder due to the fact that the crowd were mostly distracted by the weirdness of the night, and few acted like they were actually watching a competitive battle for the richest prize in wrestling. And the match itself, well, it wasn't all that good. With lots of rest holds and an overall strange vibe, the title bout was made even worse by a double pinfall finish that was meant to bridge into a rematch at King of the Ring the next month. The pay-per-view ended with scripted confusion and frustration, mirroring the genuine confusion and frustration that the performers, Shawn in particular, had shown over the previous 20 minutes. The Florence crowd were given 2 bonus matches in the form of Lawler vs Ahmed Johnson and Owen Hart vs The Ultimate Warrior before bringing a close to one of WWF's most bizarre evenings ever. But it was already decided how the situation would be rectified. On Tuesday night, May 28th, the first encore presentation of In Your House would be broadcast. On the same night, WWF was running its monthly taping of weekend program Superstars 2 hours south in the city of North Charleston. The plan was for the encore airing to show the 2 matches that had properly aired and to then redo the 3 hindered matches at the Superstars taping, then inserting them into the replay telecast. And as far as make goods go, that's a pretty clever one. Slight alterations were made to those 3 bouts. The casket match ended with the intended Mankind interference, and Vader may have lost to Yokozuna in Florence, but he won the rematch. As for Austin vs Savio Vega, well, the change made there was a very relevant one. At the time, Austin was managed by Ted DiBiase, which does sound absurd today, the idea that Stone Cold Steve Austin needed somebody to talk for him. Following the Sunday night loss to Vega, DiBiase guaranteed that Austin would win the rematch and vowed to personally leave the WWF if he didn't. After what was perhaps Vega's greatest WWF bout, Austin fell in defeat once more, and the $1 Million Man was history. As it turns out, days earlier, DiBiase accepted a 3-year offer from WCW and would turn up there in August. Weird as it may sound, the outage may have had an unintended benefit for the WWF going forwards. Pritchard remembered McMahon being especially enamored with Austin's performance in the lights-out version of the strap match. At the time, Austin was intended to compete in the very King of the Ring that Triple H was no longer winning. Is it possible then that the previously muted, still mid-card Austin was catching McMahon's eye at a time when Vince needed to build up a new top heel in Helmsley's demotion? DiBiase's exit only freed Austin up to stand more firmly on his own. Consider all of these elements, and perhaps the stars really did align for Stone Cold at exactly the right moment. As for the match itself, Austin later admitted that he was grateful there wasn't a second power outage because he's not sure if he could have withstood Vega repeatedly lashing him with the strap for a 3rd time. Not factoring in refunds, the original Beware of Dog broadcast did a rather paltry 110,000 buys. Some cable providers offered a full refund, while others, like DirecTV, only offered a fraction of the cost back. The WWF offered the replay for free to those who'd bought the original show to give them the 5 advertised matches that they'd paid for, in desirable enough form. Since then, the closest call WWE has had with anything of this type was at the 2013 Battleground pay-per-view, when the arena in Buffalo experienced a brief outage just before the main event. Otherwise, the situation at Beware of Dog is a unique one for the promotion. On the one hand, you could label the evening a disaster, as Mother Nature proved uncooperative to an incredible degree, frustrating people on both sides of the guardrail. On the other, the resourcefulness of the company and their ability to just go with it in a very stressful situation make for a mostly good story. Whatever your view is of In Your House Beware of Dog, you at least understand that it's completely unlike any other pay-per-view that professional wrestling has ever seen, for better and for worse.